Warfare was never the same after the 100 Years' War. For over a century, two kingdoms clashed in a struggle that would redefine military tactics forever. This wasn't just a conflict, it was a masterclass in strategy, where commanders turned desperation into brilliance and forged innovations that still echo through history. Today, we're stepping onto those battlefields to uncover 25 game-changing tactics that decided the fate of nations. From the thunder of English longbows to the shadowy French counterattacks, these weren't just battles. They were lessons in cunning, adaptability, and raw ingenuity. If you've ever wondered how medieval generals outsmarted their enemies against impossible odds, you're about to discover the secrets that shaped warfare for generations. To truly understand the genius behind these military strategies, we first need to step back and see the bigger picture. The so-called 100 Years' War wasn't a single, continuous conflict, but rather a series of intense battles and tense truces stretching over more than a century. It all began in 1337 when England's King Edward III, pressed by economic tensions and emboldened by his own claim to the French throne, decided to challenge France's dominance. What followed was a clash of cultures, resources, and ambitions that reshaped Europe. This wasn't just a fight over land, it was a proving ground for new ideas in warfare. Feudal levies, where nobles rallied peasants for battle, gave way to disciplined, paid soldiers. Castles, once the ultimate strongholds, became vulnerable to new siege tactics. And for the first time, entire battles could be decided not just by knights in shining armor, but by commoners wielding revolutionary weapons like the English longbow. From the muddy fields of Crecy to the desperate stand at Orléans, each battle forced commanders to adapt or perish. The stakes couldn't have been higher: control of trade routes, the fate of dynasties, even the survival of nations hung in the balance. And in this pressure cooker of conflict, some of history's most daring military strategies were born. History remembers those who innovate not just for the battles they won, but for the way they changed warfare forever. The 100 Years' War forced commanders to think differently, turning every setback into a lesson and every victory into a blueprint for future generations. But why does this matter today? Because the strategies born in this conflict weren't just medieval curiosities, they became the foundation of modern military thinking. Picture this: a world where knights, once the undisputed masters of the battlefield, suddenly found themselves outmatched by peasant archers, where towering castles designed to withstand years of siege crumbled under new artillery tactics. This was a war that shattered traditions and demanded fresh ideas. Leaders who clung to old ways faced defeat, while those who adapted wrote history. Beyond the clash of swords and arrows, the real legacy lies in the mindset. These commanders mastered the art of turning limitations into advantages, whether through logistical ingenuity, psychological warfare, or exploiting terrain. Their lessons transcend time because at its core, war is about problem solving under pressure, and that's a skill as relevant today as it was 6 centuries ago. So when we study these strategies, we're not just analyzing medieval battles, we're uncovering universal truths about leadership, resilience, and the relentless pace of change. And with that in mind, let's dive into our first game-changing tactic, the revolutionary use of the English longbow at the Battle of Crecy. The Battle of Crecy in 1346 wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. As the sun rose over that fateful field, the French knights, clad in gleaming armor and confident in their chivalric supremacy, charged forward with the full weight of medieval nobility behind them. What they didn't expect was the storm of arrows about to rewrite the rules of war. The English longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a revolution in warfare. Standing over 6 feet tall and drawn with enough force to pierce plate armor at 200 yards, It turned battles into brutal math. Where a skilled crossbowman might loose 2 bolts a minute, an English archer could unleash 10 or more arrows in the same time, creating a relentless hail of death. At Crecy and later at Agincourt, these disciplined volleys turned the tide against seemingly insurmountable odds. But raw power alone didn't secure victory. The longbow's true strength lay in its preparation. English kings understood that mastery of this weapon required years of training, so they made archery practice mandatory by law. Every village green became a training ground, forging generations of archers whose muscles bore the permanent marks of their craft. This wasn't just military policy, it was social engineering, elevating commoners into the backbone of England's army. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the arrows themselves. Imagine being a French knight bred for hand-to-hand combat, only to find your charge faltering under a sky blackened with arrows, each one capable of striking you down before you even reached the enemy. The longbow didn't just kill, it shattered morale, turning proud charges into chaotic retreats. In the end, the longbow was more than a medieval weapon, it was the great equalizer. Where feudal warfare had once been dominated by aristocratic knights, now a well-trained peasant with a simple bow could decide the fate of nations, and that shift perhaps was its most enduring legacy. While the longbow reshaped battles on open fields, another tactic emerged that struck at the very heart of France's strength, not through direct confrontation but through calculated terror. Enter the Chevaché, a ruthless campaign of devastation that turned the countryside itself into a weapon. Unlike traditional sieges or pitched battles, the Chevaché was mobility and mayhem combined. English forces, often led by commanders like Edward the Black Prince, would carve deep into French territory with a singular goal: burn everything. Crops were torched, villages reduced to ashes, and supply lines obliterated. This wasn't mindless destruction, it was economic warfare with a psychological edge. Every plume of smoke was a message to the French crown: you cannot protect your people. The brilliance of the tactic lay in its dual impact. First, it starved enemy strongholds of resources, weakening garrisons and making them vulnerable to future assaults. But more insidiously, it shattered the feudal contract between lords and peasants. When a king couldn't shield his subjects from fire and ruin, his authority crumbled alongside the charred fields. The French monarchy's legitimacy relied on its ability to defend the realm, and the Chevaché exposed that promise as hollow. Edward the Black Prince mastered this grim calculus. By avoiding fortified cities and instead targeting the undefended countryside, he forced France into a terrible choice: either muster an army to stop him likely on terrain favorable to English longbowmen, or endure the humiliation of inaction. Either way, England gained the upper hand. At times, the mere threat of a Chevaché was enough to extort concessions, as towns paid ransoms to avoid annihilation. What made this strategy so chillingly effective was its scalability. A small, fast-moving force could inflict disproportionate damage, tying down larger armies tasked with chasing them. And unlike sieges, which could drag on for months, the Chevaché delivered immediate, visible results. The scars it left weren't just on the land, they were on the minds of those who witnessed it, a lesson in how war could be waged not just against soldiers, but against an entire society's will to resist. The French High Command faced a sobering truth after Crecy and Poitiers. Their traditional style of warfare was playing right into England's hands. Charging headlong into volleys of arrows had proven disastrous, and the loss of King John II at Poitiers was a humiliation that demanded radical change. So they pivoted to a strategy as old as Rome itself. If you can't win the battles your enemy wants, refuse to fight them at all. This wasn't retreat, it was recalibration. French commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin transformed their armies into shadows, striking only when the odds favored them. Supply convoys vanished into ambushes. English forces marching through the countryside found no grand battles to fight, just empty fields and locked gates. The French abandoned chivalry's pageantry for something far more effective: exhaustion. Every mile the English advanced stretched their supply lines thinner. Every month without a decisive battle drained their coffers and morale. The brilliance of this approach lay in its restraint. Instead of risking everything in a single clash, the French turned time into their ally. Seasons passed, English armies, bred for swift campaigns, bogged down in sieges or wasted provisions chasing elusive foes. Meanwhile, the French regrouped, retrained, and crucially rearmed. Their secret weapon wasn't a new invention, but something far subtler: the disciplined avoidance of their enemies' strengths. When they did engage, the rules had changed. At Pontverlaine in 1370, Du Guesclin's forces surprised an English contingent at dawn, attacking not the heavily armored men at arms but their vulnerable horses first. Mobility lost, the English were overwhelmed. This was the Fabian strategy in microcosm: strike not where the enemy expects but where they're weakest. What makes this tactic timeless isn't just its success, it's the counterintuitive wisdom at its core. The French didn't win by being stronger, they won by being wiser. In an era obsessed with glory, they embraced the unglamorous truth: sometimes victory means letting your enemy tire themselves out chasing a fight you'll never give them. And in that patience, they found their path to resurgence. The siege of Castillon in 1453 didn't just end the 100 Years' War, it announced a seismic shift in warfare itself. As French guns roared to life, a truth became undeniable: stone walls, the very symbol of medieval power, were no longer invincible. This was the brutal dawn of gunpowder artillery on European battlefields, and its impact would echo for centuries. Those early cannons were far from perfect, unpredictable, slow to reload, and prone to exploding, but their raw destructive potential was impossible to ignore. The French, led by master tacticians like Jean Bureau, didn't just adopt this technology, they weaponized logistics around it. Artillery trains became mobile arsenals, hauled into position with grim precision. At Castillon, Bureau's guns weren't just tools, they were chess pieces, strategically placed to turn the landscape into a killing field. What made this innovation so devastating was its psychological blow. For generations, castles had been sanctuaries. Thick walls meant safety, delay meant survival. Now, gates that once withstood years of siege could be reduced to rubble in hours. The very architecture of power had to adapt overnight, with low-angled bastions replacing towering curtain walls to deflect cannonballs. Fortress design would never be the same. But the real genius lay in how the French integrated artillery with existing tactics. These weren't standalone weapons, they were part of a symphony of destruction. While cannons pounded breaches, crossbowmen and men-at-arms stood ready to exploit the chaos. At the Siege of Harfleur, the English garrison surrendered not just to bombardment, but to the unbearable certainty that resistance was futile. Gunpowder didn't just change battles, it reshaped the economics of war. Maintaining an artillery corps demanded deep coffers and technical expertise, favoring centralized kingdoms over feudal levies. The age of the knight's dominance was fading, replaced by a new era where engineers and gunners held the keys to victory. And in that shift, we see the first whispers of modern warfare where technology, not tradition, would dictate the future. While grand battles and massive sieges dominated headlines, some of the most devastating blows against the English came from the shadows. In Brittany's misty forests and rugged hills, an entirely different kind of war was being fought. One where farmers by day became fighters by night, and where knowledge of the land proved deadlier than any armored charge. The Breton resistance turned their home ground into a weapon. Every twisting path, every hidden gully became an advantage against the invaders. English patrols would vanish without a trace, their supplies suddenly aflame, their messengers found lifeless in ditches. These weren't random acts of violence, they were precise strikes against morale, designed to make every step outside garrison walls feel perilous. What made these tactics so effective wasn't just their stealth, but their sustainability. Unlike traditional armies requiring vast supplies, Breton fighters lived off the land and blended seamlessly into local populations. A blacksmith might hammer a sword one moment and sharpen a dagger the next. Villagers passed intelligence through coded messages, sometimes as simple as a laundry line hung in a particular pattern. The psychological toll on English forces was crushing. Imagine marching through what appears to be peaceful countryside, only to have arrows scream from the tree line, followed by utter silence. No ranks to charge, no banners to pursue, just an invisible enemy who dictated every engagement on their own terms. This was warfare stripped of glory, where victory wasn't measured in captured standards but in the growing exhaustion of an occupier's resolve. Centuries before modern insurgencies, Brittany demonstrated the universal truth of asymmetric conflict. When the weak refuse to fight by the strong's rules, even empires can bleed. The Bretons didn't need to win pitched battles, they just needed to make defeat unbearable for those who stayed. While England poured men and gold into its campaigns across the Channel, a storm gathered along its northern border, one that would prove even the mightiest armies have blind spots. The old alliance between Scotland and France wasn't just a political handshake, it was a dagger aimed at England's back. Every time Scottish forces crossed the Tweed, England faced an impossible choice: defend its homeland or press its advantage in France. Take Neville's Cross in 1346, a clash that might seem like a footnote, but whose ripple effects were profound. As King David II of Scotland led his army south, England couldn't ignore the threat. Troops meant for French battlefields had to pivot north, buying France precious breathing room. Though the Scots suffered defeat that day, their boldness achieved something subtler. It fractured England's focus. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its simplicity. Scotland didn't need to conquer England, it just needed to be a credible enough threat to force division. French gold and promises kept Scottish ambitions alive, turning the Highlands into a pressure valve for France's struggles. Even failed invasions served a purpose, as English garrisons remained tied down in border castles rather than reinforcing Normandy. What makes the Old Alliance so fascinating isn't just the military calculus, but the raw pragmatism behind it. Centuries before formal treaties, Scotland and France understood something timeless. In war, your ally's enemy is your leverage. Their coordination was often messy, their timing imperfect, yet the mere existence of this two-front nightmare forced England to fight with one arm behind its back. This wasn't just medieval geopolitics, it was an early lesson in the art of strategic distraction. When one kingdom's survival hinged on another's willingness to strike at the opportune moment, the battlefield ceased to be a single patch of earth, it became the entire chessboard of Europe. And in that shift, we see the birth of coalition warfare as we know it today. The fields of Poitiers in 1356 witnessed more than a battle. They became the stage for one of history's most audacious power plays. While most medieval clashes ended with scattered survivors and a retreating foe, the English under the Black Prince achieved something unprecedented. They took the King of France himself prisoner. King John II's capture wasn't just luck, it was the culmination of precision tactics. Recognizing the French king's golden helmet amid the chaos, English commanders redirected their assault like hunters isolating the lead stag. Men-at-arms pressed inward, not merely to rout the enemy but to carve a path straight to the monarch. When John finally surrendered, sword in hand, he wasn't just a defeated general, he was a living bargaining chip. The political aftershocks dwarfed the battle's body count. With France's ruler in chains, England dictated terms that would have taken decades of sieges to achieve. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 didn't just swap gold for John's freedom, it ceded nearly a third of French territory to England, including the vital port of Calais. Ransoms in that era weren't mere fines, they were economic weapons. The 3 million gold crowns demanded roughly half of France's annual revenue, crippled the Valois treasury for years. But Poitiers's real lesson lies deeper than ransom tallies. By targeting leadership directly, the English exploited a medieval vulnerability: personal rule. In an age where kingdoms revolved around a single sovereign's authority, capturing that figurehead didn't just weaken armies, it paralyzed entire governments. Without John, France spiraled into regency chaos, with rival nobles vying for control while English armies tightened their grip. This wasn't just a military victory, it was psychological warfare at its most potent. The message to every European court was clear: no monarch was untouchable. Centuries before special forces missions or drone strikes, Poitiers proved that sometimes the quickest path to victory isn't destroying an army, it's seizing the one person who makes that army matter. While the clash of armies on French soil dominated the narrative, an equally decisive struggle unfolded where the waves met the horizon. The alliance between France and Castile didn't just add another kingdom to the conflict, it shifted the war onto an entirely different battlefield, one where wooden hulls and billowing sails dictated the fate of nations. For England, the Channel had always been its moat, a natural barrier shielding it from invasion while serving as the lifeline for troops and supplies heading to the continent. But when Castile's formidable fleet entered the fray, that advantage vanished overnight. These weren't mere transport ships, they were floating fortresses, crewed by seasoned mariners who understood the brutal calculus of naval warfare. At the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372, Castilian galleys and cogs didn't just defeat the English navy, they annihilated it, sending reinforcements and precious cargo tumbling into the depths. The ramifications were immediate and devastating. With the sea lanes severed, English garrisons in France withered on the vine. Siege engines rusted without replacement parts, soldiers starved without grain shipments, and paid chests meant for mercenaries never arrived. Suddenly, a war that had once stretched across the French countryside now hinged on something as fickle as the wind. But the true lesson of Castilian naval dominance wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. By controlling the waves, they dictated the rhythm of the entire conflict. French commanders could plan offensives knowing England couldn't easily regroup or resupply. Entire campaigns stalled because a single fleet held the right patch of water. Centuries before the term sea power entered military doctrine, medieval admirals grasped its essence. The side that commands the sea controls not just where battles happen, but if they happen at all. England wouldn't forget this humiliation. The same lessons forged in the fires of La Rochelle would later shape their own naval supremacy from the Spanish Armada to Trafalgar. Because as the 100 Years' War proved, even the mightiest land forces are only as strong as the ships that sustain them. The 100 Years' War didn't just reshape kingdoms, it birthed an entire class of warriors who fought not for crowns or causes, but for cold, hard coin. Enter the great companies, roving bands of mercenaries who turned the chaos of war into a lucrative trade. These weren't the honorable knights of legend. They were hardened professionals, equally adept at storming castles or terrorizing villages when paychecks ran dry. Unshackled from feudal obligations, these companies operated with brutal efficiency. Veterans of Crécy or Poitiers, they brought discipline to the battlefield but left scorched earth in their wake. Without wars to fight, they didn't disband, they plundered, extorting protection from towns or selling their services to the highest bidder. The White Company, led by the infamous John Hawkwood, became so feared that Italian city-states paid them not to attack. Yet beneath their reputation as marauders lay a military revolution. Unlike feudal levies peasants dragged from fields with makeshift weapons, mercenaries trained year-round. Their loyalty was to profit, not princes, making them surprisingly reliable when gold flowed. The French crown, desperate to counter English longbows, hired Genoese crossbowmen. The English, in turn, recruited Flemish pikemen. Warfare became a marketplace and skill was the currency. This shift echoed far beyond battlefields. As mercenaries normalized paid service, the old feudal system where lords supplied troops in exchange for land crumbled. Kings now needed tax revenues, not oaths, to fund their armies. The great companies, for all their brutality, were the grim midwives of modern military professionalism. They proved that in war, passion was no match for cold calculation, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword but a contract. Orléans in 1429 was a city on the brink. Its walls battered, its people starving, and its hope fading with each passing day of English encirclement. Then came a 17-year-old peasant girl claiming voices from heaven had sent her to save France. To the weary defenders, Joan of Arc must have seemed like either a miracle or a madwoman. What she delivered was something far more extraordinary, a masterclass in leadership that would shatter a siege and alter the course of history. Joan's genius wasn't in battlefield tactics alone, it was in transforming an army's spirit. She arrived not with reinforcements but with unshakable conviction, wearing armor emblazoned with divine insignia. When she addressed the troops, she spoke not of survival but of destiny, framing their struggle as a holy mission. Suddenly, soldiers who'd spent months in despair began to believe they couldn't lose. That shift from desperation to fervor was her first victory. Her military decisions were just as bold. Instead of scattering French forces against every English stronghold at once, she orchestrated precise, sequential strikes. One by one, the fortified bastions surrounding Orléans fell, their garrisons overwhelmed by attackers who now fought with the intensity of the righteous. At the Tourelles fortress, Joan herself scaled a scaling ladder under a hail of arrows, taking a crossbow bolt to the shoulder but rallying her troops to fight on. The message was unmistakable. If a teenage girl could lead from the front, who among them would hang back? The English, accustomed to methodical siege warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered by something they couldn't quantify: pure, galvanizing belief. Supply lines were cut not just by swords, but by the sudden courage of local peasants inspired by Joan's presence. Even her choice to attack on Sundays, traditionally a day of truce, showed a willingness to rewrite the rules of war. Orléans didn't just mark a turning point in the war, it revealed a timeless truth about conflict. Joan proved that an army's strength lies not just in its weapons, but in its willingness to believe in the impossible. Centuries before modern psychology studied morale, she demonstrated its power in the most visceral way possible, by turning a doomed city into a beacon of hope and a ragged band of soldiers into the architects of a miracle. By the mid-15th century, France had learned the hard way that feudal armies were no match for professional warfare. While English forces still relied on bursts of seasonal campaigns followed by costly demobilizations, King Charles VII made a revolutionary decision. If France wanted lasting victory, it needed soldiers who fought not out of obligation but as a full-time profession. The birth of the Compagnie's d'Ordonnance in 1445 wasn't just a military upgrade, it was the dawn of modern warfare. These weren't temporary recruits or opportunistic mercenaries. For the first time in medieval Europe, a nation fielded a standing army, permanent, salaried troops who trained relentlessly between conflicts. Each compagnie operated like a well-oiled machine, 1,500 men divided into specialized units of lancers, archers, and support personnel, all outfitted with standardized arms and armor. Discipline replaced chaotic individual heroics. Coordinated maneuvers trumped feudal banners clashing at random. The contrast with England's exhausted forces was stark. While English commanders struggled to reassemble their armies for each new campaign, France's professional corps remained battle-ready year-round. French knights, once prone to reckless charges, now drilled alongside crossbowmen in formations that maximized combined arms tactics. Supply chains were systematized, ensuring troops received pay and provisions on schedule, no more looting out of desperation. This reliability made them terrifyingly effective. But the real genius lay beyond battlefield tactics. The ordnance system shifted warfare's financial burden from haphazard feudal obligations to state-controlled taxation, funded by a permanent royal war chest. King Charles didn't just raise an army, he built an institution, and in doing so, he forged a template that would define European military power for centuries. Cannons could win sieges and arrows could decimate ranks, but France's ultimate weapon proved to be something far more enduring: the institutionalization of war itself. This transformation echoes even today. Every modern soldier who dons a uniform traces a lineage back to Charles's revolutionary vision. The moment warfare ceased to be a seasonal trade and became the disciplined, professional pursuit we recognize now. The 100 Years' War ended not with a single battle, but with the quiet, relentless efficiency of an idea whose time had come. Paris was burning, not from English arrows, but from the embers of betrayal. In 1419, a single act of violence on a Montereau bridge didn't just claim the life of Burgundy's Duke John the Fearless, it ignited a seismic shift in the war. The Burgundians, once staunch French allies, suddenly turned their cloaks, sealing an unholy pact with England that would bring France to its knees. This wasn't just a political realignment, it was a masterstroke of opportunism that proved loyalty in war lasts only as long as the advantage does. The Burgundian Betrayal cut deeper than any sword. With control over wealthy northern territories and Paris itself, their defection handed England the keys to France's heartland overnight. Troops that had once fought alongside the French now stood shoulder to shoulder with their enemies, while Burgundy's spies fed England every weakness they'd learned as allies. The psychological blow was catastrophic. If even the kingdom's own dukes couldn't be trusted, who could? But the real brilliance of this maneuver lay in its timing. England's Henry V, already fresh off his Agincourt triumph, recognized that Burgundy's grievances with the French crown were more valuable than another battlefield victory. By offering the Burgundians vengeance for their murdered duke and a share of the spoils, he turned France's internal strife into his greatest weapon. Suddenly, England didn't need to conquer Paris. The Burgundians simply opened the gates for them. This wasn't just about power, it was about perception. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which declared Henry V heir to France, was only possible because Burgundy's support lent it a veneer of legitimacy. To the rest of Europe, it looked less like an English invasion and more like a civil war, with Burgundy's backing making Henry's claim palatable. The lesson: in war, controlling the narrative can be as decisive as controlling the battlefield. Yet alliances forged in betrayal rarely last. Decades later, when Burgundy's interests shifted again, they'd abandon England just as ruthlessly, proving that in the calculus of medieval politics there were no permanent friends, only permanent advantages. And that unpredictability, perhaps, was the deadliest weapon of all. The fields of Formigny in 1450 weren't just a battlefield, they were a laboratory where medieval warfare evolved into something far deadlier. Here, France didn't just defeat the English, they redefined combat itself by orchestrating the first true symphony of combined arms. No single weapon won the day instead. It was the ruthless choreography of cannons, cavalry, and infantry working in lethal harmony. French commanders had learned from decades of humiliation. This time, they didn't hurl knights headlong into arrow storms or rely on fragmented feudal levies. Instead, they positioned their new gunpowder artillery with surgical precision, bombarding the English formations until their legendary longbowmen, exhausted and exposed, could no longer hold their ground. Then came the hammer blow, disciplined cavalry charges striking not the front where stakes and arrows might repel them, but the vulnerable flanks. What made Formigny revolutionary wasn't brute force, it was timing. Each element played its role in sequence like gears in a clockwork killing machine. The cannons disrupted and demoralized, the cavalry shattered cohesion, and finally, the advancing infantry sealed the fate of any survivors. This wasn't a chaotic melee, it was warfare refined to a science. The English, masters of defensive positioning, suddenly found their playbook obsolete. Their longbows, devastating in static battles, became liabilities against an enemy that refused to fight on predictable terms. Worse, their commanders had no answer for an opponent who could strike from multiple angles at once, artillery punching holes, horsemen exploiting them, and infantry swarming through the breaches. Formigny's legacy echoes far beyond the 100 Years' War. In this bloody afternoon, we see the embryonic form of every modern army's doctrine. The understanding that victory belongs to those who can blend firepower, mobility, and shock action into a single devastating instrument. Napoleon's grand tactics, blitzkrieg's speed, they all trace their roots to this forgotten field where France proved that the future of war wasn't in single weapons, but in their orchestration. The Knights of France rode toward Agincourt with the full confidence of their class nobility bred for war, mounted on towering destriers, certain that one good charge would scatter the English rabble before them. What they didn't see until it was too late were the slender wooden stakes glinting in the morning light, planted at angles by common archers the night before. This was the palisade defense in action, so simple in concept, so devastating in execution. English commanders, perpetually outnumbered, had learned that survival often hinged on turning the battlefield itself into a weapon. Before the first arrow flew, they transformed muddy fields into death traps. Each sharpened stake, driven into the earth just far enough to hold firm, became an unyielding sentinel against cavalry. The French charge, meant to trample men into the dirt, instead found itself funneled into narrow, murderous corridors where longbowmen could pick their targets with ease. But the brilliance of these defenses wasn't just in their construction, it was in their psychology. A mounted knight's greatest strength was momentum, the crushing weight of 1,000 pounds of armor and horseflesh moving as one. Take that away, and suddenly the invincible became vulnerable. At Agincourt, horses impaled themselves on stakes, their riders thrown into the mud to be finished off by daggers in the press. The palisades didn't just stop the charge, they shattered the myth of cavalry's invincibility. What makes this tactic so enduringly fascinating is its democratic brutality. A nobleman's lifetime of training, his lineage of martial pride, meant nothing against a peasant-planted stake. The English didn't just defend, they inverted the social order of warfare itself. And in that inversion, they proved a universal truth. In battle, preparation often outweighs valor, and the cleverest solutions are sometimes the humblest. In 1515, as Henry V's army marched triumphantly through Normandy, they encountered something far more demoralizing than enemy soldiers' smoke. Not from English torches, but French ones, villages burned not by invaders, but by their own people, their crops reduced to ashes, wells poisoned or filled with debris. This was no accident, it was a deliberate act of sacrifice, a scorched earth strategy turned inward to starve the enemy into submission. The French had learned from bitter experience. After decades of English Chevauchés laying waste to their countryside, they adopted the same brutal logic but with a defensive twist. By torching their own lands ahead of Henry's advance, they transformed abundance into a wasteland. Supply lines, the lifeblood of any medieval army, withered overnight. No granaries to plunder, no fresh water to drink, no fodder for horses. Henry's men, already stretched thin by dysentery and exhaustion, found themselves in a nightmare of their own making, conquering territory that could no longer sustain them. What made this tactic so devastating wasn't just its ruthlessness, it was its psychological toll. Soldiers who expected to live off the land now trudged through blackened fields, their boots kicking up the ash of their would-be meals. Morale crumbled faster than supplies. Disease, always a camp follower, spread like wildfire among malnourished troops. By the time Henry reached Agincourt, his army was a shadow of its former strength, its ranks hollowed out by hunger as much as battle. Yet the true genius of this strategy lay in its asymmetry. The French could afford the loss, their heartland remained untouched, their supply depots intact. For Henry, every scorched acre was a problem with no solution. Unlike the English Chevaché, which aimed to terrorize, this was surgical economic warfare. The message was clear: you may win battles, but you will not feed your army. History often remembers Agincourt's arrows and mud, but the real turning point came earlier in those smoldering villages. Because while glory belongs to the victors on the field, survival sometimes belongs to those willing to make the unthinkable choice, to burn today so they might live to fight tomorrow. 16th strategy. The Welsh Longbowmen, the shadow arsenal behind England's triumphs, behind every English victory in the 100 Years' War, stood an often overlooked force, men who spoke in lilting Welsh rather than clipped English, whose arrows flew just as true but whose names rarely made it into royal chronicles. While history remembers the English longbow as a game-changer, its deadliest practitioners often came from the rugged hills of Wales. Generations of border conflicts had forged the Welsh into peerless archers long before England recognized their value. Their bows weren't just tools, they were extensions of their bodies, crafted from native yew and tempered by lifetimes of hunting and guerrilla warfare. Where English archers trained under royal decree, the Welsh learned their craft out of necessity. Every missed shot might mean a hungry winter. That desperation bred precision. When England absorbed Wales, it didn't just gain territory, it gained an entire culture of warriors. Welsh longbowmen brought more than just strength to English ranks. They brought a predatory instinct honed in ambushes and raids. Their arrows didn't just rain down, they snipped French commanders from saddles at ranges that defied belief. At battles like Poitiers, where disciplined volleys decided the day, Welsh accuracy turned the tide in moments. Yet their contribution went deeper than battlefield prowess. The Welsh were proof that empires thrive when they harness the strengths of all their peoples, not just the dominant group. English kings smart enough to reward Welsh archers with pay and status reaped the benefits of their loyalty. Those who treated them as second-class soldiers often faced rebellion instead. The lesson here isn't just about bows, it's about the invisible threads that hold armies and kingdoms together. The Welsh longbowmen remind us that history's most feared weapons are nothing without the hands that wield them, and that the quietest voices sometimes carry the deadliest consequences. 17th strategy. The Treaty of Troyes, when a pen outstripped the sword in the dim candlelight of a Troyes cathedral in 1420. A single document rewrote the future of two nations with nothing more than ink and wax. The Treaty of Troyes wasn't just a peace agreement, it was a political earthquake, declaring England's Henry V the legitimate heir to France's throne. Overnight, the 100 Years' War seemed won not by arrows or sieges, but by the deft strokes of diplomacy. The audacity of the move still staggers historians. With the French king Charles VI suffering bouts of madness and his disinherited son, the Dauphin, tainted by rumors of illegitimacy, Henry saw an opening no army could create. By marrying Charles's daughter and securing Burgundy's backing, he transformed England from foreign invader to legal successor. The message was brilliant in its simplicity. Why conquer France when you could inherit it? But parchment victories come with invisible costs. For French commoners, the treaty wasn't a resolution, it was a betrayal. The Dauphin's supporters dismissed it as English trickery, rallying around the exiled prince with renewed fervor. Resistance flared in provinces untouched by battle, fueled not by soldiers' orders but by gut-deep national pride. The very act meant to end the war instead birthed something far more dangerous, a unified French identity forged in defiance of foreign rule. The treaty's fatal flaw lay in its assumption that politics could override patriotism. Henry's sudden death just 2 years later left an infant as heir to both crowns, and the tide of resentment became a tsunami. Joan of Arc's march to crown the Dauphin at Reims wasn't just military, it was symbolic, a ritualistic shredding of Troy's legitimacy before the eyes of Europe. What makes Troyes a masterclass in strategy isn't its success, but its cautionary lesson. It proved that even the most cunning legal maneuver is fragile without the consent of those it claims to rule. Swords can enforce borders, but only hearts can sustain them, a truth as potent in medieval courts as it is in modern geopolitics. Next section, transition if needed. Yet for all its diplomatic drama, Troyes paled in comparison to the raw terror unleashed by history's first organized artillery corps, a story of gunpowder, grit, and the birth of modern warfare. Note, transition provided only if bridging to a subsequent artillery-focused segment. Adjust based on actual next topic. 18th strategy. The Ghosts of Agincourt, how French partisans turned defeat into a war of attrition after the mud of Agincourt had dried and the English banners fluttered victoriously over Normandy. Something unexpected happened. The war didn't end, it simply changed shape. While English garrisons celebrated their triumph, shadows moved in the forests and alleys. These weren't knights or noblemen, they were butchers, blacksmiths, farmers, anyone with a grudge and a blade. History remembers them as écorcheurs, skinners, a dark nod to their brutal methods, but their true legacy, proving that even the most crushing battlefield defeat could be undone by relentless, invisible resistance. The French partisans fought with no chivalrous rules, no grand charges, just a simple creed: make every English patrol fear the road home. A supply wagon would vanish overnight, its guards found hanging from trees. A careless sentry might take an arrow from a haystack. Even in occupied towns, English soldiers slept with daggers in hand, knowing tavern keepers could slip poison into their wine. This wasn't war as Europe understood it. It was something far older, far crueler. What made their tactics so devastating wasn't just violence, it was persistence. Unlike feudal armies that disbanded after battles, these guerrillas never stood down. They melted into villages by day, becoming invisible until the moment to strike arrived. English commanders trained for set-piece battles suddenly faced an enemy that refused to assemble in neat formations. The psychological toll was crushing. No victory felt permanent, no territory was truly secure, and here's the twist: the partisans didn't need to win battles to win the war. Every ambush forced England to divert troops from conquest to occupation, draining their treasury and morale. Every burned bridge meant longer supply lines, stretching their forces thinner. Time, that merciless ally, worked for the French now. While England bled itself white holding stolen land, the partisans ensured there'd be little left to govern but ruins and resentment. The lesson echoed far beyond medieval France. From Napoleon's nightmares in Spain to modern insurgencies, Agincourt's ghosts taught the world this: you can defeat an army on the field, but you cannot conquer a people who refuse to surrender. Because resistance, when it has no uniform and no front line, is a fire that no occupation can fully extinguish. Optional transition if continuing to another tactic. Yet even shadows must eventually step into the light, and when France's partisans finally rallied behind a single banner, their revenge would reshape the very landscape of power. 19th strategy, the silent stranglehold. England's river blockades for all the thunder of battles and sieges. Some of England's most decisive victories in the 100 Years' War came not on land but on water, specifically the winding arteries of France's rivers. While castles stood as symbols of power, it was the Seine, Loire, and Garonne that truly kept the kingdom alive, carrying grain to cities, soldiers to frontiers, and gold to treasuries. And England, with cold precision, set out to sever those lifelines. Naval blockades transformed rivers into weapons of economic suffocation. English ships, often little more than repurposed merchant cocks armed with archers, anchored at strategic bends where currents narrowed. Any French vessel daring to run the gauntlet faced a storm of fire arrows and grappling hooks. The goal wasn't just interception, it was paralysis. Paris, reliant on shipments from Normandy's farms, watched prices for a loaf of bread climb to obscene heights as blockades tightened. Rouen, a bustling hub of trade, became a ghost town where merchants whispered of starvation. But the real brilliance lay in how these blockades fractured French coordination. Without secure river routes, reinforcements took weeks longer to march overland, arriving exhausted or too late. Messages between fortresses were intercepted, leaving commanders isolated and guessing. Even the French crown's tax revenues dwindled as coin-laden barges languished upstream. Rivers, once the veins of France's prosperity, now pumped poison through its heart. Geography, as the old adage goes, is the silent general, and England listened well. By dominating the Seine, they turned northern France into a patchwork of trapped garrisons. Holding Bordeaux as river access kept their Gascon foothold supplied despite being surrounded by hostile territory. Unlike flashy battlefield triumphs, river control was a slow, relentless pressure that didn't just weaken armies, it eroded the very will to resist. The lesson echoed far beyond medieval Europe. From the Union's Anaconda Plan in the American Civil War to modern strait closures, history's greatest strategists have understood one truth. Sometimes the surest path to victory isn't storming the gates, it's quietly turning the keys in the locks. 20th strategy, when darkness became a weapon. France's night raids. There's a particular kind of fear that comes with being a soldier under siege. Not just the dread of arrows or battering rams, but the gnawing uncertainty of what moves in the dark. And in the 100 Years' War, French commanders like Etienne de Vignoles, better known as La Hire, mastered the art of turning night itself into a battlefield. While English troops huddled around campfires, convinced the darkness shielded them, they learned too late that shadows could bite back. These weren't chaotic brawls under moonlight, they were surgical strikes honed to perfection. La Hire's raiders moved like ghosts, their movements timed to the nervous rhythms of exhausted sentries. Horses' hooves were muffled with cloth, armor blackened with soot, and signals given by touch rather than sound. By the time the alarm was raised, the damage was already done. Supply wagons ablaze, siege engines sabotaged, and key officers cut down before they could rally their men. The goal wasn't just destruction, it was psychological erosion. Morning would reveal not just losses, but the chilling realization that no hour was safe. The genius of these raids lay in their asymmetry. A nighttime assault required no grand numbers, just precision and audacity. 100 well-placed Frenchmen could paralyze an army 10 times their size, forcing commanders to double guards, ration sleep, and second-guess every rustle in the underbrush. Sieges that should have lasted weeks collapsed under the strain of relentless tension. At Orléans, Joan of Arc herself embraced these tactics, using the cover of darkness to resupply the city right under English noses. But perhaps the most devastating effect was on morale. Medieval soldiers already feared the supernatural. The night was when demons roamed, when the veil between worlds thinned. By weaponizing that primal terror, the French didn't just attack bodies, they shattered minds. Sleep-deprived English archers fumbled their shots. Knights, trained for daylight duels, grew paranoid in the flicker of torchlight. Victory no longer required outnumbering the enemy, just outthinking them in the hours when courage faltered. This was warfare stripped to its essence, not brute force, but the ability to manipulate an opponent's perception, to turn their own instincts against them. Centuries before special forces adopted night vision goggles, La Hire proved that darkness isn't just the absence of light, it's the perfect canvas for audacity. Optional transition if continuing. Yet for all their mastery of the night, the French faced a threat even shadows couldn't hide: England's secret weapon, hidden not in darkness but in plain sight. 21st strategy, the feigned flight. How England turned retreat into victory at Crecy. On the blood-soaked fields of Crecy, the English didn't just hold their ground, they pretended to break it. As the French knights thundered forward, eager to crush what seemed like a panicked retreat, they had no idea they were charging headlong into one of history's most lethal traps. The feigned flight wasn't just a tactic, it was psychological warfare at its most devastating, turning the enemy's greatest strengths, pride and momentum, into their deadliest weaknesses. The execution was deceptively simple. Small groups of English men-at-arms would suddenly peel away from formation, dropping banners and scrambling backward as if routed. To the French nobility, raised on tales of chivalric pursuit, this was irresistible. Knights would spur their horses into reckless pursuit, only to find the fleeing soldiers wheeling around at a prearranged signal, now backed by fresh ranks of longbowmen who rained death on the now disorganized French. The muddy terrain, already churned by cavalry, became a killing zone where packed knights couldn't maneuver or retreat. What made this strategy so effective wasn't just the element of surprise, but its exploitation of medieval culture itself. Honor-bound knights saw retreat as shameful, a sign of cowardice to be punished. The English, understanding this instinct, weaponized it. By playing the role of frightened prey, they transformed the French charge from a disciplined advance into a chaotic mob, their formations shattered by terrain and their armor no match for arrows fired at point-blank range. The brilliance of the feigned flight lay in its duality. It was both a military tactic and a social commentary. In an age where warfare was governed by rituals of bravery, the English demonstrated that victory often belonged to those willing to appear weak until the moment they struck. Crecy's lesson echoes through every ambush in history. Sometimes the surest path to triumph begins with a strategic step backward. Yet the true legacy of this ruse wasn't just the bodies left on the field, it was the humiliation of an entire military ethos. After Crecy, the French would never again assume that a fleeing enemy was truly broken. A single afternoon of deception had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that in war, perception could be deadlier than any sword. Optional transition. But while the English mastered the art of illusion, the French were quietly perfecting a far darker craft, one that turned terror into territory. 22nd strategy. The invisible hand of the church. How popes played peacemaker amid the clash of steel and the roar of cannon fire. Another force quietly shaped the 100 Years' War, one that wielded no sword but commanded something far mightier: the power of faith. When battlefields grew too bloody and kings too stubborn, it was often a pope's envoy, robed in white, who stepped between warring factions with parchment instead of pikes. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was spiritual arbitration on a scale rarely seen before, proving that even in Europe's most brutal conflict, the pen could sometimes still the sword. The Vatican's interventions were as strategic as they were sacred. Popes like Clement VI and Benedict XIII didn't merely beg for peace, they leveraged their unique position as Christendom's moral compass. To refuse a papal truce wasn't just a political snub, it risked alienating devout populations and inviting divine condemnation. Kings who might ignore rival monarchs found it harder to dismiss a mediator claiming God's own authority. These pauses in fighting, though often fleeting, became lifelines for war-ravaged nations. The Truce of Calais in 1347, brokered after years of papal pressure, halted hostilities long enough for France to rebuild shattered defenses. England, equally exhausted, used the respite to refill drained treasuries. Even short ceasefires had cascading effects. Peasants replanted scorched fields, merchants reopened trade routes, and commanders reassessed tactics away from the fog of war. Yet the Church's role wasn't purely altruistic. Every truce reinforced papal influence, reminding Europe's kings that spiritual power could still temper earthly ambitions. When the Avignon papacy allied closely with France negotiated terms, or when later popes threatened excommunication, they weren't just saving souls, they were playing chess with crowns as pieces. The lesson here transcends medieval history. In an age where warfare seems dominated by brute force, the 100 Years' War reminds us that pauses matter as much as battles. Whether through papal bulls or modern ceasefires, the spaces between conflicts often determine their ultimate outcome, because even the fiercest warriors need moments to catch their breath, regroup, and remember what they're fighting for. Optional transition if continuing. But while the Church sought to calm the storm, one French commander was learning to harness its fury, transforming weather itself into a weapon. 23rd Strategy, the wall makers of Paris when citizens became soldiers while kings plotted grand campaigns and nobles clashed on open fields. Some of France's most stubborn resistance came from an unlikely source: the cobblestone streets of its own cities. Paris, Rouen, and other urban strongholds didn't just rely on royal armies to defend them. They armed their butchers, bakers, and stonemasons, turning everyday citizens into a bristling wall of defiance. These militias might have lacked the discipline of professional soldiers, but they made up for it with something far more potent: a bone-deep refusal to let invaders trample their homes. Picture the scene: English forces, fresh from victories in the countryside, arriving at city gates expecting surrender, only to find rooftops lined with crossbowmen who knew every alley and cellar. These weren't hired mercenaries who might flee when pay ran low. They were fathers guarding their children's bedrooms, guildsmen defending workshops passed down for generations. When the call to arms sounded, a tailor might trade his needle for a spear, or a blacksmith reforge his tools into arrowheads. The very stones of the city seemed to fight back. What made these militias so formidable wasn't just their numbers, it was their ingenuity. Without formal training, they improvised. Boiling oil rained from gatehouses not by royal decree, but because tavern keepers knew how to handle cauldrons. Barricades sprang up overnight, built from overturned carts and furniture. In Paris, militia captains even used the Seine's currents to ferry supplies under cover of darkness, outsmarting blockades with the same cunning that once haggled over wool prices. Yet the true genius of this strategy lay in its unpredictability. Professional armies moved by the book, but urban fighters wrote their own rules. A narrow street might suddenly become a killing zone where armored knights, trapped between close walls, fell to hooks and axes meant for livestock and timber. The psychological toll on attackers was crushing. Conquering a rebellious city wasn't like storming a castle. It meant fighting an entire population, room by room, in a struggle without honor or surrender. This was war stripped of its pageantry, proof that the strongest fortifications aren't always made of stone. When people fight not for gold or glory, but for the right to wake up in their own beds, even the mightiest armies can find themselves outmatched, not by skill, but by sheer stubborn will. The lesson echoes from medieval Paris to modern insurgencies. You can break gates, but you cannot break spirit. Optional transition if continuing. Yet for all their resilience, these militias faced a threat no barricade could stop, a weapon that didn't just knock down walls but shattered the very idea of safety. 24th strategy, the English winter campaigns when cold became an ally while most medieval armies holed up in winter quarters, huddling around fires until spring. The English did something extraordinary. They marched. King Henry V's forces didn't just endure the cold, they weaponized it, turning frozen rivers into roads and snowstorms into cloaks of invisibility. Where others saw hardship, the English saw opportunity, because in war, the greatest advantage often lies in doing what your enemy thinks impossible. Winter campaigns shattered every convention of medieval warfare. French commanders accustomed to seasonal truces dismissed the idea of fighting through sleet and mud. Their garrisons, undermanned and complacent, were caught utterly unprepared when English columns materialized like ghosts in the fog. At the Siege of Harfleur in 1415, Henry's men dug trenches in freezing rain, their breath steaming in the air as French defenders, shivering behind walls, marveled at their sheer audacity. The message was clear: if they'll fight in this, what won't they endure? But the genius of these off-season strikes wasn't just surprise, it was logistics. Frozen ground meant heavy carts could move without sinking into muck. Leafless trees revealed enemy movements for miles, and the psychological edge was even sharper. Every English soldier who survived a winter march grew tougher, while their foes, soft from months of idle comfort, faltered at the first gust of wind. Henry understood something timeless about human nature: misery loves company, but discipline thrives in its absence. The French paid dearly for underestimating the cold. At Agincourt, their knights, bogged down in rain-soaked mud, learned too late that winter wasn't just a season, it was an unspoken ally to those who embraced it. While they struggled in sodden armor, English archers, hardened by months of campaigning in brutal conditions, loosed arrows with numb fingers but steady resolve. Victory didn't just belong to the strong, it belonged to those who could outlast. This strategy's legacy stretches far beyond medieval battlefields. From Napoleon's frozen retreat from Moscow to modern special forces training in extreme environments, history's greatest commanders share one lesson: the elements are neutral. They favor no side, only those willing to adapt, endure, and turn adversity into an edge. Because when everyone else waits for fair weather, the bold carve their path through the storm. Optional transition if continuing. Yet for all their mastery of winter's bite, the English would soon face a force even frost couldn't slow, an enemy whose fury burned hottest when the odds were coldest. 25th strategy, the last storm: how France united to win a century-long war by 1450. Something extraordinary was happening in France, something that hadn't been seen for generations. Nobles who once feuded now marched under the same banner. Cities that had paid ransoms to survive opened their gates to a single royal army. Even the mercenaries, those wolves of war, fell into disciplined ranks. After a century of fragmentation, France had finally become France, not just a kingdom but a nation. And that shift, more than any battlefield genius, sealed England's fate. Charles VII's triumph wasn't won with a single brilliant tactic, but with something far subtler: the quiet, grinding work of unity. The same artillery that shattered castle walls at Castillon now moved in lockstep with armored cavalry. The once divided regions of Normandy and Aquitaine, bled dry by decades of occupation, swelled with fresh troops eager to reclaim their homes. Even the notorious écorcheurs, the rogue bands of deserters and bandits, were folded into a new professional army, given purpose, pay, and a stake in the fight. This wasn't just better strategy, it was a complete reimagining of what France could be when it stopped fighting itself. The contrast with England couldn't have been starker. While France rallied, England's war effort crumbled under the weight of political infighting and financial exhaustion. the legendary Longbowmen, once unstoppable, now faced enemies who had studied their every weakness. English commander, used to exploiting French disunity, suddenly confronted an opponent that moved with terrifying coordination. Sieges that once lasted months now ended in weeks as French cannons pounded while fresh troops rotated in from secure supply lines. The lesson was clear: a kingdom divided against itself can survive, but only a nation truly united can win. What makes this final offensive so fascinating isn't just its success, it's the blueprint it left behind. The 100 Years' War didn't just end with a treaty, it ended with the birth of something new. The conflict that began as a feudal squabble over crowns concluded with the first stirrings of modern nationalism. Peasants who once identified only with their local lords now spoke of La France, a land worth bleeding for, not because a king demanded it, but because they believed in it. And that, perhaps, is the war's most enduring legacy. Battles fade, tactics evolve, but the raw power of shared identity remains. Because when people fight not for a ruler's ambition, but for the idea of home, even the longest wars can reach their end. The English didn't just lose territories in those final years. They faced a force no arrow could pierce and no gold could bribe, the unbreakable will of a people who had finally found their cause. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a conflict, it was a crucible that reshaped the very nature of warfare. From muddy fields to besieged cities, from midnight raids to grand political gambits, every strategy we've explored carried the same defining truth: survival belonged to those who adapted. Whether through the longbow's relentless hail, the chilling efficiency of scorched earth, or Joan of Arc's unshakable conviction, victory rarely went to the strongest but to the cleverest. What makes these tactics timeless isn't their brutality, it's their ingenuity. They remind us that even in an age of swords and sieges, the real weapons were often ideas, turning weather into an ally, loyalty into leverage, and even retreat into deception. The commanders who thrived didn't just follow the rules of war, they rewrote them, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy far greater than battlefields. They showed us that conflict at its core is a test of human creativity under pressure. So which of these 25 strategies resonates most with you? Was it the Welsh longbowmen's quiet dominance, the Chevauchee's ruthless efficiency, or perhaps the way France turned unity itself into a weapon? Let's keep the conversation alive in the comments. History's greatest lessons emerge when we share our perspectives. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into the minds of history's master tacticians, don't forget to subscribe. Because the past isn't just a record of what happened, it's a playbook for what's possible. Until next time, remember, the next great innovation might be hiding in the pages of history. You just have to know where to look.